Okay, so Paticca Samuppada, condition-dependent origination. First of all, it's the 1st of January 2019, so Happy New Year! Hope it's a good one for you. So, if you're wondering what on earth I'm going on about, then please check out the first video, the introduction to Paticca Samuppada for the background. I'm going to crack on with talking about conditionality. What is conditionality? Such an integral and fundamental part of everything that the Buddha taught. So, conditionality means that one thing exists only because of the existence of something else. That nothing is truly independent. That there aren't these self-standing, isolated objects and things. That there is an interdependent relationship to everything. And this is what lies at the heart of Paticca Samuppada. So, to try to explain conditionality for you, we could use the example of a tree. So, it appears as though there is a self-existing separate entity called a tree, which is separate from all the other conditions that lie about it. But how independent is it really? For instance, can there be a tree if there is no sunlight? Can there be a tree if there is no rain? Can there be a tree if there are no nutrients for it to draw up from the ground? So the reality is that if you took those conditions away, there would be nothing to support the existence of the tree would die. Okay. So all the things that I've mentioned are necessary conditions for the existence of the tree. And that's what we mean by condition-dependent origination. That the existence of one thing is reliant, dependent upon, there are necessary supporting conditions for its existence, and if you take those away, it ceases. So the aphorism that the Buddha used was, when this is, that comes to be, with the arising of this, that arises. When this is not, that does not come to be, with the ceasing of this, that ceases. So, again, just to reiterate, there is this web of interconnectedness. Now, there are some essential conditions and there are less essential, non-essential conditions. So, for instance, in the example of a tree, it may very well be that the tree takes on a funny appearance because of the surrounding countryside. Perhaps the tree is near a coast and it gets hit by a lot of wind, and so that has an influence on the sort of shape that it takes. But that condition is not an essential condition. The tree will live as long as there's sunlight, rain and nutrients. So there are essential conditions and non-essential conditions. And when we look at the 12 links of condition-dependent origination, the Buddha is talking about the absolute necessary condition for the arising of the subsequent condition. As we go through all 12 links, you'll see how that pans out. And so that's a very important point to remember, that he's talking about the absolute essential necessary conditions that give rise ultimately to suffering. And the point is, through understanding the conditions, the necessary conditions that give rise to suffering, through the removal of those conditions, you remove the suffering. So this points back to the essence of the whole point of the Buddha's search for and discovery of nirvana or nibbana, enlightenment, call it what you will, it is the cessation of suffering. And so that is why condition-dependent origination is so important, and why it's so important to understand conditionality. There's a lot to conditionality. We're not going to focus in this episode on ultimate reality, but when through practicing insight meditation you actually start to explore in depth the arising and passing away of ultimate phenomena. Like I say, we'll get to that in a subsequent episode. You start to see how fundamental conditionality is to the arising of conscious experience, and how it is the failure to understand the conditioned and conditioning nature of existence that causes the mind to misinterpret experience and fall into the trap of believing in selfhood, believing that the me, is an independent, sovereign entity which is separate from all the conditions that go on around it, that there is some aspect of us which is not subject to conditions, which is not part of this matrix of interweaving transient conditions. So if you have a look at the wheel of Paticca Samuppada, you see that what I've just spoken of is present in the first link and the last link. So the first link is avijja, ignorance. The last link is the decay, death, the sorrow, lamentation, grief, suffering, disease, old age and death that arises from having been born in the first place. So he starts with ignorance of the true nature of reality, which is that ignorance is falling into the belief of me as being separate from the rest of the world. The moment that veil of ignorance comes down and that belief is created, then you get the wheel of suffering that ends up with sorrow, lamentation, pain, despair, old age, disease and death. And just to point out that what was it that prompted the Buddha's deep inquiry into finding the cessation of suffering? It was his bearing witness to the suffering inherent in life through the three divine messengers of old age, disease and death. So it all fits. The aim of this teaching was to discover Paticca Samuppada. So I'm not sure what else I should say at the moment. But let's go through some of the links anyway. For instance, to bring home what I'm saying about he is stripping down the infinitely complex set of conditions that exist at any one moment. So if you imagine that there is this, as it were, matrix of conditioned and conditioning phenomena arising and passing away, and he is drawing out the absolutely essential links in that matrix of conditioned and conditioning phenomena. So if we consider the last two links, so the sorrow, lamentation, grief, suffering, disease, old age and death, what is the necessary condition for the arising of those things? What is old age dependent upon? The absolute necessary condition upon which old age occurs, and that is there has to be a body to age, there has to be a body to be diseased. So to experience sorrow, lamentation, pain, despair, there has to be a mind. So what is that actually saying? It's saying that there has to be birth. I mean, it sounds completely obvious, when you point it out, but it is absolutely the case that for something to die, something has to be born in the first place. And I don't intend to go through all the links in this episode thinking about it. It's probably too much. We'll perhaps go through that in the next episode. So, but it's what we're doing here, I think, is just creating the right conditions, the right conditions for further inquiry. So just laying out the scene. Although it's obvious, it's actually deeply profound that there has to be birth for there to be subsequent old age, disease, and death. So in order to overcome suffering, you have to overcome the problem of birth. And then you have to ask yourself, what gives rise to birth? Now, for many people in the West, well, not just in the West, that's a silly thing to say, for many people with a material outlook on life, that is to say that there is the belief that matter is the forerunner of mind. What we're going to go into will be intolerable because it will go so against such a person's view structure. So you have to be at least open to the idea that it is the case that mind is the forerunner of material processes. That mind is not simply the outcome of material process. Materiality has a function in the establishing of consciousness, of course, but it is not the forerunner of consciousness. There is prior experience that gives rise to subsequent experience. So, yeah, that's quite an interesting place to leave it. Leave you dangling with this notion. So, and remember that even if that is difficult to accept, because of course it immediately brings into our sights the whole idea of rebirth. But this is totally about rebirth. Absolutely, it's about rebirth. Rebirth from life to life, rebirth within a life, rebirth from moment to moment. So it absolutely is all about rebirth. So a final point to leave on then, if that is difficult to accept, and the Buddha's teaching is only asking for an open mind, because you have to have an open mind in order to enter into the actual practice of meditation, in order to find out for oneself the reality of Paticca Samuppada. Is it actually what is happening? That is the crucial question. And the Buddha called his teaching, what did he call his teaching? A come and see thing. That is to say that it's open to scrutiny, and the truths to which it points are discernible for oneself by oneself. The Buddha's teaching is the vehicle that allows that to happen. So there will be, of course, lots of doubts. There are even doubts about Paticca Samuppada amongst Buddhists. There are some people who maintain that they are Buddhists who also maintain that the Buddha never taught rebirth. Well, if that's the case, then certainly I don't know what I'm talking about, and everything that we're going to be talking about in this video is redundant, and the whole idea of being able to get off the wheel of rebirth is redundant, and therefore enlightenment is redundant, therefore there being a cessation of suffering is redundant. So if you have doubts, acknowledge the doubts. If you have doubt and you're interested in order to discover the truth of condition-dependent origination for yourself, the healthy thing to do is to acknowledge the doubt name it. Be very clear that what you are experiencing is doubt, and that's perfectly understandable, perfectly acceptable. But then continue to practice the way. So that's practicing mindfulness, practicing meditation, learning to note everything that's going on in your experience, learning to discern all the little things that are actually happening in your experience. I think that's a very good point to make about Paticca Samuppada. Note everything, all 12 links, although not all of them will be immediately obvious, all 12 links are just your everyday experience. It's just what is literally unfolding now, and we will get into it in subsequent episodes. But it is the case that the Buddha is just asking us to stop, to learn to pay attention to our experience, rather always endlessly chasing the carrot and trying to get away from the dagger perpetually hurling itself towards us. That's an analogy that I once used of samsara as the wheel of perpetual rebirth as being like a mouse's wheel, and we're caught on the mouse's wheel, and in front of us is perpetually dangling a carrot, and behind us there is this dagger forever pointing at us, and so we are forever running on that mouse's wheel, aiming for the carrot and trying to get away from the dagger. And at some point we have to realise that we never get stabbed in the back and we never get the carrot. That it's just a never-ending process, a never-ending becoming. And through the process of meditation you learn to stop running. You learn to slow down, to stop the wheel turning, and then eventually you get off the wheel. So I don't know how I got from one place to the other. So the important thing is, yes, to recognise that this is just our everyday reality that we're talking about, but it's just looking at it very clearly with great discernment, with what we call mindfulness and clear comprehension of all these components of experience. So the point is, according to the Buddha's teaching, is that you do experience ignorance. You do experience karma formations, consciousness, mind and body, the six sense spaces. I mean, six sense spaces. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. Feelings, sense contacts, so sounds and tastes and touches and shape and colour. We do experience all these things. So it's just learning to look closely at what is actually unfolding in your experience. The truth, the law of karma, the law of condition-dependent origination is just seen for what it is when we are not preoccupied with chasing the carrots and trying to avoid being stabbed in the back the whole time. So it's learning to put down our concerns for long enough each day that we can actually mindfully observe and see the truth of how things are indeed arising and passing away due to conditions. So you have to have, I was going to say you have to have faith, because you have to undertake it not knowing whether this is true or not. That is absolutely the case with the Buddha's teaching. Faith is not a bad thing. Faith is a good thing. You need faith to undertake any kind of adventure. It's people with excessive doubt that find it difficult to get up in the morning. It's people with excessive doubt who won't try things. It's healthy to have a certain amount of doubt and to take that doubt with you, but that's why I mention about having the courage to note doubt as doubt. Doubt is a very subtle hindrance. It's the most subtle hindrance because it's the one with the most lethal to anyone following a spiritual path, because it's the one that stops you undertaking the journey. It's the one that stops you from undertaking the journey. And it's that little voice in us which sounds like that's just us commenting about what's actually going on with our spiritual practices. We don't associate it as being a hindrance. We just think it's that little voice which is forever outside of whatever we're doing, which is commenting and judging, and the doubt is saying, well, don't do this until you have more information. Don't do this until you know it's going to work. But the only way you can, with the Buddha's teaching, that you can know whether it works is to undertake it, to undertake that journey and follow that journey through. And people do, and people have. And I hope that people will, because it is a truly amazing thing to discover that the way you thought life was is actually not true, and it is different fundamentally to the way that you thought it was. And it's a terrible shame, really, that because people might have preordained first principles and assumptions, that they find it easier to take elements out of the Buddha's teaching that don't accord with those axiomatic first principles, rather than questioning their first principles. It's very understandable, but this is a journey about coming to understand where our emotional attachments really are, and you let go of those emotional attachments through seeing the suffering that they cause. And that's what Paticca Samuppada is all about. That's what developing mindfulness is all about. Coming to see what are the necessary, essential conditions that give rise to suffering. And we find that it's those first principles on which we have created our lives, which are ultimately the problem. Or I'm just pausing there, because actually it is the ignorance of the true nature of life which is the problem. The ignorance of the true nature of life gives rise to the wrong first premise, and it's once you've established the first wrong premise, then you are caught on this never-ending cycle of becoming, samsara, the endless process of rebirth, which always leads to old age, decay, and death. Kind of went off my intended subject a bit there, but again, I think I've gone through that without any full stops whatsoever. But maybe you'll go through the video a few times. Yes, this is what I wanted to mention. Please do put any questions, observations, comments in the links below, in the comments section below. The link to the PDF of Paticca Samuppada is now working. Thanks, Roland, for advising me about that. But yeah, any questions, any comments, because they will help me establish what it is that you guys need to know about Paticca Samuppada, and hopefully that will help us along our way. So my New Year's resolution, you shouldn't really put New Year's resolutions. Why would you wait for New Year to put, if there was something that you needed to do, why not just do it? But my New Year's resolution anyway is to do this every few days. We'll see how we go. But for now, see ya.